good afternoon or good morning, or I mean, even good evening, depending on where you're listening from. But I would hazard a guess and say the majority of listeners are listening in from Dublin today, or from Ireland at least, with some listening in probably not West Coast states, because that might be a little bit too early for them, but certainly East Coast and Central. And I think there might even be someone from Mountain Standard Time as well. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening from. This is LinkedIn Live, my weekly LinkedIn Live, which was rescheduled from last week with my lovely guest, Karen Weeks, who was podcast episode number 71. Wow. I think it was. So hit the 70 numbers already, which is strange, but also very, very exciting. Karen, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then we can start talking about some of the key points that we covered on the podcast. We will be taking any questions that you have. If you've listened to the podcast already, or even if you haven't, we're happy to answer any questions that you have, whether you're listening live or whether you're listening on the replay. Just let us know. It was a really, really interesting conversation, and very much from the HR perspective, which I really, really enjoyed as well. So Karen, do you want to kind of kick things off?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. So that's actually a perfect segue from the HR perspective, because I am an HR person. 20 years ago, I actually made a career change into HR from theater and stage management and Hollywood and all the art side of the world. But I absolutely fell in love with it. And so I've grown my career throughout those years. And currently I'm the head of people and culture for a tech company called Order Groove. And then I also do career coaching on the side. So help people outside of Order Groove, help them with their careers, whether that's, finding a place that makes sense for them, whether that's totally changing what they want to do, evolving their career internally, or even helping new managers, sort of get settled into their new role, however I can help. So that's it. And I love what I do and love building cultures that support all these amazing humans that we're bringing into our companies.
Yeah, this is it. And I think we are very aligned on a lot of the thinking that we have, a lot of the approaches that we would take, and the philosophies, if you like. And I know I'm always conscious, because I did receive this feedback when I put out a survey about the podcast, and someone suggested that I should bring more people with the dissenting views to my own. And I do try and challenge people's thinking, and, but it is always nice to have someone whose views are quite aligned with mine, I suppose. And, it's this reinforcing belief that you're like, okay, I think I'm on the right path if a few people buy into what it is that I'm saying. But Karen, we covered quite a range of topics on the podcast. We kind of started by talking about things like onboarding and how to, especially in this really difficult climate at the moment. Like, we spoke about onboarding. We spoke about trust as well. And in particular, we spoke about mental health. We touched on the topic of burnout, but the subsequent podcast, we kind of went into a little bit more detail on burnout specifically. But we kind of spoke about creating the space for those conversations to actually happen, and the importance of doing that. Do you want to kind of give people a flavor of the types of things that we spoke about on the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And it actually ties starting with onboarding. So, from day one, you should be creating this sense of trust, this space to have any conversation that the employee needs to have, that as a manager, you are there for them as a human, as well as the person on their team that's trying to hit goals and doing all the great things that the team is supposed to be doing. So by showing vulnerability, sharing your own stories, being empathetic, listening, building the respect and trust from day one, then you have said, this is how I manage. This is what's important to me. This is the culture that we've created either for this team or for this company. And so you're setting the tone, and then you can have throughout, hopefully their long tenure, conversations about development that may or may not be easy to have depending on what their goals are. About mental health and burnout, even just about things that are going on in life. And by the way, I know for some folks this is uncomfortable and like, oh, I don't want to go too personal. I'm not their therapist. I was always told not to talk about these things. And I led those trainings, by the way, like 10 years ago. We absolutely told managers, like, here's the line in the sand. Please do not go past it.
Yeah.
It's just changed. And
it's interesting how things have evolved in that way, because, similarly, when I was, let's say, on the receiving end of management training, it was very much you keep it work related. You don't necessarily go down the road of, you have friendships outside of work, obviously, and you have people who you might confide in and things like that. But certainly the types of conversations that are happening now in the workplace weren't happening, and weren't being trained to how to handle them 10 years ago.
Yeah. And we're also not looking for managers to be any of those replacements either, right? Like you're not their therapist, both literally, and we are not asking them to be. So you should, send them to the experts when the time is right. It's more just letting them know you care, because everybody's a full, well-rounded human, and they're bringing that to the workplace. So if you understand what's important to them in life, if you understand their stresses in life, then that ties directly into what they need out of this job at this moment, what their goals may be, how that might change, what's motivating them at this moment. So it all ties back to work. But we're just recognizing that people aren't as siloed and compartmentalized as we're either trying to make them or we thought they were. I'm not totally sure which one it is yet.
Yeah. And it's this idea of bringing your whole self to work, and you don't have to check yourself at the door, and you can actually be yourself. And we spoke about this probably separately, didn't go into a huge amount of detail on the podcast itself, but the idea of values and bringing people into the organization whose values align with those of the organization. And I've just recently finished reading a book all about values. Shout out to Ariel O'Farrell, by the way, an amazing book. And I'm like, I just want everyone to read that book now to understand more about the importance of them, the importance of reducing conflict, having aligned values, increasing retention and engagement and things like that. Like, I think it's just hugely, hugely important. We spoke about the employee promise as well. So what is the value that you create for the team? Like, that's one of the kind of core questions. Sorry, Karen, I interrupted you. You were about to say something there.
No, it's all good. And actually it ties to the value promise as well. As, one of Orta Groove's values is what you see is what you get, which is all about authenticity. So if we then don't ask the managers to support people bringing their authentic selves, and we don't live up to that value through our promise, it's a disconnect. So
totally.
it hopefully kind of just keeps tying everything together for us.
Yeah. This is it. And you're so right, because so many, and I have worked in those organizations where they say one thing, but actually, exactly as you described, there's a disconnect there between what's being said and how people are behaving. And the higher up you go in the organization, the more amplified that impact is, because the more eyes that you have on you, seeing what you're doing, how you're behaving, how you're making decisions. And if it's not in line with the values that have been stated, the values that have been shared, then it causes this kind of rift, and people begin to lose trust in the organization as well. That's something that we certainly came up a few times on the podcast, is this idea of trust and respect.
Yes, absolutely. And the minute you start to break that, it's so much harder to rebuild. I'm sure everybody's heard of the savings bank analogy, but trust is like a savings bank. You make deposits and you make withdrawals, and those withdrawals are way more impactful than the deposits that you can make.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you start making withdrawals on those, once you start eroding away at people's sense of trust, I think it's really important. And we touched on it as well. Like, it goes both ways. It's not just, it's the trustworthiness and the trusting nature, let's say, of people as well. So it's kind of a little bit of both. We spoke as well about purpose and finding the why, flexibility, and like this attitude of work from anywhere. And I've heard that quite a lot recently as well. And it's a really great, but exactly as we spoke about, it's bringing it back to the why are we actually doing this? Why are we here in the first place? And, building a sense of community, having a common language through disc profiling, specifically in your organization, so that we can talk about how different people communicate, like to be communicated to. I know we in one of my previous organizations, we did start that process, but we kind of did it, and it wasn't really necessarily followed through very well. But certainly, I think it's really important understanding how different people like to communicate.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to it actually all keeps circling together is the authentic self, right? Like uh,
Mm,
you should meet me in the middle. I'm not saying that as a manager you need to totally change how you are because you're hiring people and so people need to meet you in the middle, but if you know that I need to take time to process information versus I can brainstorm and just kind of talk things out, those are two very different ways of communication. And know that
mm,
about me as your employer, I should know that about you as a manager. It's only going to strengthen our relationship and bring us to a place where we can work together easier versus assuming that you're not paying attention or you don't care or that you
mm.
never shut up or any of the things that come with the bad assumptions when you don't know someone or
Yeah.
understand someone.
Yeah. This is it. And the assumptions that we make.
Yeah.
We touched on in tying in with what we spoke about, the authenticity and meeting people where they are, this psychological safety and how to create that environment of psychological safety where people can feel free to be themselves, where they can touch on those subjects or have those difficult conversations where things aren't really going according to plan, or when there is a breakdown in communication or different communication styles or whatever it might be. Any thoughts to share on that? I know we touched on it in the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really also comes down to managers being vulnerable. So you create psychological safety by showing
Mm.
that you're willing to, that you
Yeah.
think it's safe enough to share yourself. And
Yeah.
while you
Yeah.
can't say, oh, I know exactly what you're going through, because you don't, because everybody has
Mm.
different situations, but you can say, look, there was a time in my career where I didn't know what I wanted to do, or there was a time in my career that I was in the wrong position. I tell people that a lot. There was a time in my HR career that I was a comp analyst and it was such a bad fit for so many reasons. And I was struggling and it
Okay.
was horrible and it was just bad.
Yeah.
And so when
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
talking to someone about who might be struggling in their performance, I'll share my own story so they know they're not alone,
Mm.
that we all kind of go through these moments. And that creates
Yeah.
the safety of like, oh, other people can understand this. So I think that
Yeah.
vulnerability piece is really important.
Yeah, I think it's important to have that attitude of learning as well. Like, what can I
Yes.
learn from this experience? I can learn that actually the comp benefits analysis is not an area of strength for me, or maybe it's not an area of interest. Now, if I'm being brutally honest, like that sounds like an ideal type of role for me. I'm like, you're talking about money and you're talking about analysis. Wow, okay. But I can understand, Karen, it's not necessarily the right thing for you. I'm just a total data nerd. I love getting my head around and looking at modeling and all of that type of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think in another life I might be some sort of an auditor or something like that, where I'm picking out all of the differences and explaining them. And yeah, anyway, we're totally digressing. Is there anything else that you would like to share in relation to the podcast? Like, give people a reason that they might want to tune into it. I think I probably forgot to mention at the start, but I did mention in the description that the link to the full episode is in the comments below. So if you haven't listened to the full episode, then you can click on the comments below for anyone who is tuning in.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would sort of call out, and this is actually why I love the name of your podcast and the work that you do, is that it's the reason why happiness at work is so important is because it helps people feel connected to the work that they're doing and why they're there and gives them purpose. It's not, oh, everybody should be happy like sunshine and rainbows and unicorns.
Yeah.
It actually makes people better employees, better
Yeah.
managers. You'll get to your business results. People will stay longer. They'll be
Yeah.
engaged. Like they'll help solve problems. They'll collaborate more. All the things you actually need them to do to have a successful business, because people
Yeah.
are what drive your business, is because they're enjoying the work they do and they're happy in their jobs.
Yeah.
So there's real reason behind all this, which I know your research has showed over and over again. And I
Yeah.
think that's something that
Absolutely.
we need to keep remembering.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a good point, Karen. I mean, sometimes you can't think of happiness at work being all fluffy and like say sunshine and rainbows and oh, let's all be happy at work. And it's like, no, it does have a merit to it. So, for businesses that are not necessarily people focused, and I have seen research around this as well. It's like, oh, have a look at Wall Street, because actually there's companies there that are performing okay and they're not people focused, but it's thinking about it from a different perspective, that how could they have performed if they had focused on their people and that opportunity, and there might be a big gap between that. So if you focus on people, naturally You save money from lower attrition rates. You've got higher retention, higher engagement. People are more involved. They're psychologically, they feel psychologically safe, or they feel like they're in a psychologically safe environment. So they're sharing their ideas and their innovations without fear of repercussions or anything like that. So, you won't get any arguments from me in relation to happiness at work. You know, I have bought into that already 100%. Karen, if people want to connect with you, you are tagged in this post, so they can connect with you through LinkedIn that way. Tell us a little bit more about how else people can connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn is definitely the best way to reach me. If you're curious about my side work as a coach, you can also go to karendweeks.com. And shameless plug, Order Groove is hiring. So if you're looking for a new job, ordergroove.com/careers and come join the team.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you so much for your time today, for your time on the podcast as well. I always enjoy our conversations. So thank you, Karen. I really, really appreciate that.
Thank you.